This week is a big week in the life of the faith community as we kick off Lent on Wednesday with Ash Wednesday service. We'll have it at 6 o'clock in the chapel, and we invite you to come as it's a reflective time as we prepare for this Lenten journey that leads us to Easter. We're also deeply thankful for Carol, as well as Bridget and George and the youth ministry team for their hard work the last couple days with Punahou parking for the carnival. I saw pictures on Facebook. There were a lot of cars here. How many of you went to Punahou Carnival? How many of you are still paying for it? Yeah, that food is rich and all good for you, I'm sure, too. But in your bulletin is your take-home work. If you would pull that out and put it in your purse or your pocket, that we can go deeper this week as we explore the life of Joseph and end our look at Genesis before we move into Exodus beginning next week. So would you pray with me as we begin this sermon together? Our God, you are the God who has called us to be a part of a greater community, your church. On this day, may we have ears that may hear and hearts that are willing to join with one another through the good and the bad and everything in between, so that we may be your church for this world today. For it's in the name of Christ our Lord that we pray. Amen. For 6 weeks, we've been looking at the idea of how do we help equip you to grow deep in faith. And these are tools that aren't new to us. In fact, they're tools from the ancient church that we continue to practice in our world today. Many are seen in light of what they do for me, but also what they do for us. And today, our last tool to experience spiritual transformation is the word community. Community. It's what we all are a part of when we say that we're a part of a church. We are part of a greater community in which we learn how to do life together. Interestingly, these passages that were read earlier are the two key passages that most people go to when they say, what should the church be like? If I have a dream church and can make it exactly the way it should be, most people will say Acts 2 is the model of the church that I want to go to, or maybe Acts 4. In fact, I did a Google search yesterday, and there was 149 million results when you type in Acts 2 church. 149 million results. This isn't new that people want this kind of church. Just 100 years ago, outside of Chicago, a new city was formed called Zion. And the newspaper article said this: Reverend John Alexander Dowie left little to chance when he created the city of Zion as a carefully ordered religious utopia. He immediately outlawed sin. Sit with that for a second. He immediately outlawed sin in this utopic experience of a community. What he ended up finding out is that you can't stop people from being people. And that perfect place soon became unperfect. But what he was after was trying to create a perfect community with a perfect church in which there was no problems ever in that community. And guess what happened? People showed up and problems ensued. Not purposeful, but we as people have this amazing ability to care for each other and also hurt each other. And it's not always purposeful. Sometimes it happens, and yet we always take it personally that it's an aim at someone else. And what we hear over and over again, 4 churches long, is that if we could just be that Acts 2 kind of church, then everything would be okay. Well, immediately after Acts 4, that second reading, what we find is that the religious community after Acts 4 is never perfect again. Acts 5 is a story of a couple that go and they sell their field and bring the proceeds, but only half, like the guy that they named Barnabas to the disciples. And immediately there's a judgment based upon this couple because they learned how to play church, how to look like they're doing it without actually doing it. That almost immediately humanity within them took over, in which they wanted to look the part but not act the part. Which leads to this question, why community? Why do you need community in your life? What difference does it make, if any at all? Well, according to an article that was published in Slate magazine 2 years ago, it said this: loneliness has doubled since 1980. 40% of adults in 2 recent surveys said that they are lonely, up from 20% in the 80s. 40% of adults consider themselves lonely. What implication does that have on us as a people? Well, the article continues. Studies of elderly people in social isolation concluded that those without adequate social interaction were twice as likely to die early. So if you take someone that's elderly and is homebound, they are twice as likely to die early because they are lonely. 2 churches ago that I served, there was a woman named Ruth that would come in every Sunday, and we called her the hugger. And Ruth would go around hugging every person that she could possibly get around. It was a very formal church in which everyone put out their hands, but she was a huggy kind of lady, and she would go and hug anyone and everyone, regardless if a hand was out or not. So one day I said to her, Ruth, I don't know if you've noticed, but lots of people put out their hands to shake. Why do you hug everyone? She said to me, David, this is the only day that I have any kind of personal contact with anyone else. And my hope is that I get enough hugs today to make it to next Sunday. None of us knew that she was so isolated and alone. But what we found out in this church was that there were a lot of people that were in this situation, where they longed for a sense of community within their own congregation. The survey also revealed this: the increased mortality risk from loneliness is comparable to that of smoking and twice as dangerous as obesity. Social isolation impairs immune function and boosts inflammation, which can lead to arthritis, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. The reality of our lives is that we are created on purpose and with a purpose, and that purpose is found together. We aren't created to be solitary creatures. No, we are created for community, to be a part of something greater than ourselves that gives back to this world, that makes us feel like we have grounding with another. And yet in a world that is so fast-paced and we're so interconnected with Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff, what we found is that the loneliness saga has doubled with the more of technology that we have. I don't know about you, but I would imagine there's a few of us that can attest to the feelings of loneliness, of isolation, of the desire of being a part of something greater, of a community of faith, and hence walk into a church looking for that thing. Interestingly, I read many years ago a statistic about churches, and it was shocking to me. The reason why someone picks a church is discerned in the first 5 minutes that they show up to that church. Not because of how great the music and the choir is, not because of the good looks of the ministers, although that helps. Kidding. People show up to church, again, because of you. They show up because of the hospitality and the sense of community that you share with others. And by the time they get to this point in the service, 34 minutes into it, they've already decided if they're coming back here again or not. And it has nothing to do with your staff or our worship style. It has to do with you and your hospitality. The beauty of Hawaii, and you all in general, is that you're the huggiest people I've ever met. If you had diapers, you would wear Huggies. Because this is a community that loves to embrace each other and hug. But the challenge for us is, how do we take it from hugs to something more that is sustaining for our well-being? How do we be a church? Well, one professor from University of Maryland found that people are 30 times more likely to laugh when they are with others versus when they are alone. You are 30 times more likely to laugh when you're in a community than you are when you're by yourself. And what they found was that only 15% of the things they laughed about was actually funny. They would laugh because there was a sense of togetherness and that we're in this together. We're in this together. At Central Union Church, there is no I in the church. There's we. We're in this together to be there for one another, to celebrate life together, to walk through the struggles that we face, to be a community together. Some of you have been in this church 80 plus years, and others are brand new today. Wherever you have been, whether 80 years or brand new today, this place is a place in which we have arms wide open and invite you to come and to journey through life with us. See, oftentimes in our society, we think of I, and in the church world, it always starts with we. We is the key of our scriptures. Since the beginning of humanity was created with we, with God and two individuals. And in that place of connection, they found purpose, togetherness, community. Why is it that we in the church world makes things so complicated? I've often found that the easiest thing to talk about, what does it mean to be a church, is that we do life together. That's it. We as a church like to complicate things by putting lots of structures and layers to things. But in essence, the purpose of the church is to do life together. To worship God, to eat a meal, to celebrate, to mourn, to laugh, to play. And we don't have to put structures around that. It's just doing life together as a community, like the Acts 2 and 4 church appear to do. But as we read this passage, another passage pops into my mind from Ecclesiastes. And it says this, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm, like last night. Anyone cold? But how can one stay warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. I'm sure you've seen rope before. That stuff that intertwines with itself that gives it its strength. And then a one-corded piece of rope is easy to break, but you get these cords that are intertwined with multiple ropes. It's almost impossible to break through it. And in essence, that's what the church has always been about, a people that intertwine our lives together that nothing can break us apart. And so the 3 cords of our life together is God's presence being the first. Is that God dwells with us not just at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, but God dwells us wherever we gather together. Whether that's at a coffee shop or a restaurant, at the beach or at a home, God is there with us. And because God is with us, we are strengthened together. And so the essence of the church is always God's gathered community. God's people called and invited to do something amazing in this world with God taking the charge. The second cord is the one another. One another is used in our scriptures far more than any singular idea. That we are invited to do life with one another, to care for one another, to pray for one another, to support one another, to cry with one another, to find ways of being together. Eugene Peterson, an author and pastor, wrote this: there can be no maturity in the spiritual life, no obedience in following Jesus, no wholeness in the Christian life apart from an immersion in and embrace of community. I am not myself by myself. I am not myself by myself. It is with one another that we discover who we are. Certainly there are things that we do alone, of soul searching and looking in the mirror, but in essence we find the fullness of our lives together. Isn't that good news? And the third cord is mutual support. There are no needs in that early church. We always trumps me in the church. Interestingly, I asked on Bible study on Wednesday nights about this passage and what does it sound like? If you had to put a political system or ideology around this passage of Acts 2 and 4, does it sound like the capitalistic notion of how we're to be together? No. It sounds, in fact, very socialistic. The image of the early church was a community that shared everything that they had so that no one ever had need. But here's the kicker. There was no one ever in the stands watching. They were all active participants in the community. And so everyone included ensured that no one ever had need, whether that was financial or emotional or spiritual, because they shared everything that they had with one another. It's a beautiful image of the church. Whether it would work as a way of doing government, I have no idea. But as a way of the people of God, yes. We're called to share our blessings. Why? Because they're God's gifts to us to share with one another. We're called to take that which we have in our hands, our talents, our gifts, our resources, and share them so that we can change the world together. And that no one would ever walk among us who would ever have any kind of needs. Wouldn't it be beautiful to be a part of a church? When people ask, what's your church like? They talk about, my needs are met because I share that which I have and we get this return tenfold of what I didn't expect. Wouldn't it be amazing to be a part of a church that didn't constantly have argumentations, but instead found that when they sat around the feet of Jesus, they found all that they ever needed? Wouldn't it be beautiful to be a part of a community of faith that gathered together to celebrate what God was doing among us, believing that God is never done, but God continues to take incredibly imperfect people like you and like me and somehow allow grace to be the economy of our community? Wouldn't it be amazing to be a part of a community in which forgiveness wasn't talked about but lived? That how often should we forgive each other? 7 times, 70 times, a perfect number, endlessly. That we forgive each other. Because as long as there's two people together, eventually we'll end up hurting each other. What if the church wasn't about people being perfect and learning how to play the game of faith, but instead being authentic and learning how to care about each other for all the good and all the bad that we carry with us? What if we were a community of faith in which no one was ever alone, but instead always felt supported and loved and cared for? What if you and I were a community of faith that didn't throw the word Christian around every time we want our way done, but instead that we're followers of the way of Jesus Christ, trying to embody Christ in the world around us? You see, this vision of the church that this early church had is like a utopia that we're invited to dream about. And the challenge of the church has been and always will be is as long as you put people in the mix, it's going to get messed up. I mess things up. I'm sure Pastor Brandon will mess something up eventually. But what I know is that we keep striving to do the thing that God has called us to do now. And that when we find that we are wrong, we quickly admit it. When we find that we have a better way of doing things, we live into that together. That what we find is that the church is supposed to be the simple thing that we do, not complex and hard. So my question for you as we look at these 6 weeks of equipping, how do we be God's people for this day and age? How do we be a community of faith that lifts each other up and inspires each other to do something greater than we could ever do alone? How do we be a church that sees our stuff as not mine, but ours? And then we get to share all of our gifts and graces with one another, and so that no one would ever have need among us. You see, that's the kind of church that 149 million people search for. That's the kind of church that every generation has tried to build. My hope is that's the type of church that we try to become. Fully realizing that the utopia of Acts 2 and 4 were quickly lost. But the church is always running back to that in the dream of what we might become. We can't do it alone. We must do it together. And so may we find peace together. May we find hope together. But most of all, may we celebrate that God's love never fails us together. Amen.